In the grim darkness of the far future, in the endless war of Warhammer 40K, humanity has learned to fear loud things. It fears the roar of bolters, it fears the scream of demons, it fears the chittering advance of tyrannid swarms and the metallic march of awakening Necron legions. It fears the battle, cries of orcs and the traitorous hymns of chaos cults. Noise is danger, fury is corruption, fire is heresy. But what if the end did not come screaming? What if it arrived as silence? The Imperium of Man stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, but it is not truly united by hope. It is bound together by momentum. For 10,000 years, since the internment of the Emperor of Mankind upon the Golden Throne, humanity has existed in a state of permanent emergency. The Astronomicon burns, the tithes flow, the regiments march. Hive cities produce soldiers faster than they produce dreams. Every day, somewhere in the void, 1,000,000,000 souls are offered up to maintain a war that cannot be won, but must never be abandoned. And no one asks why, because to ask why is to hesitate, and hesitation is death. Except someone did ask. Not a war master, not an inquisitor, not a chaos prophet, a clerk. His name was Malvernese Hale, and he was insignificant by every measurable metric. He held no rank beyond senior archivist in the administratum. His duties were monotonous, collating casualty reports from Segmentum Solar, processing attrition statistics from frontier war zones, balancing the numbers of regiments raised against regiments. Annihilated, he lived in a hive, stack that never saw natural light. He ate ration paste with nutrient density carefully calculated to prevent both starvation and comfort. He slept 4 hours per cycle and spent the rest immersed in numbers. Numbers never screamed, they never begged. They never lied, they simply accumulated. At first, Hale performed his work with the same mechanical obedience as billions of others. He catalogued the dead of Armageddon's latest conflict. He processed the losses sustained during the Indomitus Crusade launched by Robout Guilliman. He calculated the population deficits of worlds consumed by Hive Fleet Leviathan. He entered into the ledgers the tithe adjustments following the 13th Black Crusade led by Abaddon the Despoiler. Each statistic was another grain of sand in an infinite desert. Then one day, without meaning to, he totaled everything. 10,000 years of recorded war. 10,000 years of losses categorized as acceptable. He cross-referenced population growth against battlefield mortality. He analyzed planetary compliance rates versus extermination orders. He studied the frequency of exterminatus authorizations compared to successful long-term reclamation. He ran projections forward 100 years, 1,000, 10,000. The curve did not bend toward survival. It bent toward exhaustion. The Imperium was not collapsing in a dramatic blaze. It was eroding, slowly. Relentlessly, every victory required 10 sacrifices. Every reclaimed world demanded 3 more to replace it. The Astronomicon itself consumed psychers by the 1,000 each day. Humanity was burning its own future as fuel for the present. And the enemies surrounding it, chaos, tyrannids, orcs, necrons, were not weakening at the same rate. Some were strengthening. Hale recalculated. Again, the numbers remained. Humanity, by his projections, would not win. It would not stabilize, it would not achieve peace. It would simply continue bleeding, consuming itself, stretching thinner, until the galaxy itself decided otherwise. That realization did not come with rage. It did not inspire rebellion. It did not ignite faith. It brought something far more dangerous. Clarity. He began to write not in official ledgers, but in private datas, lates encrypted beneath layers of bureaucratic redundancy. He did not call it a manifesto. He called it a hypothesis. If existence equals suffering, and suffering feeds the warp, and the warp strengthens chaos, and chaos prolongs suffering, then existence itself sustains the enemy. If tyrannids require biomass, then humanity's survival feeds them. If orcs require war, then humanity's resistance empowers them. If Necrons desire dominion, then humanity provides subjects. Every path of survival strengthened an adversary. What if the only true denial was absence? The thought horrified him at first. The Imperium taught that life was sacred because it served the Emperor. But Hale stared at casualty figures that dwarfed comprehension. Entire Hive cities erased, Forge worlds shattered, civilizations reduced to footnotes. If life was sacred, why was it spent so freely? Why did devotion require perpetual slaughter? He refined the hypothesis into a single sentence: to struggle is to prolong the feast. He did not share it publicly. Not yet. He simply continued working, watching, counting. But ideas do not remain isolated in the Imperium. Information travels along the same data lines as tithes and orders. Fragments of his analysis slipped into administrative summaries. A footnote here, a statistical anomaly there, a revised projection appended to an otherwise mundane report. No dramatic declaration, just questions embedded within numbers, and numbers are persuasive. Across the sector, other clerks noticed the irregularities. Junior adepts recalculated casualty ratios and reached similar conclusions. Planetary governors, already straining under impossible tithe demands, reviewed the projections and saw no path to prosperity, only to deferred destruction. Even some within the Adeptus Mechanicus quietly acknowledged the inefficiency of endless war as a long-term strategy. The idea spread not through sermons, but through spreadsheets. It did not promise salvation. It offered inevitability. Soon, the hypothesis gained a name among those who whispered it in encrypted communiques: the Gospel of Silent Extinction. The name was almost ironic. It was not religious in origin. It invoked no gods, made no rituals mandatory. It simply proposed that in a universe structured around predation, removing the prey was the ultimate act of defiance. Not suicide in despair, but withdrawal in protest, a refusal to participate in cosmic cruelty. The first world to embrace it was not particularly important. Surinth Prime was an industrial hive, world of moderate output, compliant, loyal, unremarkable. Its governor had received Hale's projections months earlier. He studied them privately. He compared them to his own reports of failing infrastructure, rising cult activity, declining morale. He consulted ecclesiarchy priests, who offered only intensified devotion. He consulted the Adeptus Arbites, who recommended stricter enforcement. He consulted his own conscience, which was tired. No invasion threatened Surinth Prime. No warp storm loomed. The world was stable, if one could call perpetual overwork and quiet starvation stable, and perhaps that was precisely why the decision crystallized there. The announcement was never made publicly. Instead, production schedules subtly shifted. Medical facilities increased distribution of a particular nutritional supplement. Agricultural sectors adjusted crop strains to include compounds harmless in isolation, but lethal in cumulative dosage. The changes were small, bureaucratic, invisible to external observers. Within 6 months, birth rates declined sharply. Within 9, mortality quietly surpassed replacement. Within a year, entire HAB blocks reported zero activity. There were no riots, no panic, no mass hysteria. The population had been prepared gradually through quiet dissemination of the Gospel's logic. Datus late circulated essays. Workers discussed projections during rest cycles. Families debated the ethics of bringing children into a galaxy statistically destined for annihilation. The conclusion, reached individually but shared collectively, was simple: enough. When the Adeptus Arbites finally investigated the silence, they found no barricades, no cult altars, no demon sigils. They found citizens in their dwellings, resting as if asleep, infrastructure intact, records orderly, tithes paid in advance. Across every public terminal, one message scrolled endlessly: "We have chosen quiet." The shock that rippled through the Imperium was unlike any triggered by rebellion or invasion. This was not defiance in the traditional sense. It was compliance taken to its logical extreme. Surinth Prime had not rejected the Imperium, it had concluded it. The Inquisition descended immediately. Ordo Hereticus searched for evidence of chaos influence. None was found. Ordo Malleus probed for warp disturbances. The psychic residue was minimal. Ordo Xenos tested for alien manipulation. Negative, there was no external corruptor, only arithmetic. Reports were sealed. Public knowledge was restricted. The official explanation cited a rare atmospheric toxin, but suppression could not erase the underlying question. Administratum networks had already archived Hale's projections. Other worlds had already run the calculations. And the numbers did not lie. On distant planets, governors began reviewing their own futures. Forge worlds burdened by impossible quotas considered the diminishing returns of perpetual sacrifice. Agri, worlds calculated how many harvests remained before soil depletion outpaced recovery. Even some within the Astra Militarum. Soldiers who had watched entire regiments vanish for marginal strategic gains found the Gospel's premise disturbingly rational. If victory is impossible, what is the purpose of survival? The Imperium had always answered that question with faith. The Emperor protects, humanity endures, sacrifice is noble, but the Gospel offered a counterpoint. Endurance without end is not nobility, it is inertia. Protection that requires infinite victims is not salvation, it is consumption. For the first time in millennia, a heresy emerged that did not rely on temptation or rage. It relied on fatigue, and fatigue was universal. Within 2 decades, 3 more worlds followed Surinth Prime's example. Each time the pattern was identical: orderly decline, peaceful cessation, minimal warp disturbance. No signs of chaos, no alien involvement, just populations that had collectively stepped off the battlefield of existence. Astropaths reported something strange in the regions surrounding these silent worlds. The immaterium felt thinner, less turbulent, as if the emotional static generated by billions of anxious minds had simply faded. Navigators passing through noted fewer warp eddies. Demonic incursions decreased in adjacent systems. It was subtle, but measurable. For some radical inquisitors, this was the most alarming day, the point of all. If extinction reduced warp instability, then extinction had strategic value. The thought was unthinkable. The Imperium existed to preserve humanity at all costs, to even entertain the possibility that fewer humans might equal greater stability bordered on treason of the highest order. Yet the evidence accumulated quietly, like Hale's original numbers. The gospel did not spread through fiery preachers. It spread through tired conversations in dim hab cells, through parents who had buried too many children, through officers who had signed too many casualty reports, through scribes who, like Hale, had seen the full ledger of 10,000 years. It asked no one to worship, it asked no one to hate, it asked only one question: if your existence feeds the horrors you fear, why continue feeding them? By the time the High Lords of Terra officially acknowledged the phenomenon, it was no longer confined to obscure sectors. It had become an idea embedded in the Imperium's subconscious, a quiet alternative to endless war, a final, rational option in a galaxy where rationality had long been sacrificed to survival. And Malvernese Hale, the insignificant clerk who first totaled the dead, watched from his dim archive chamber as the data updated. For the first time in 10,000 years, casualty projections dipped not because victories increased, but because participants decreased. The galaxy was not growing safer, it was growing quieter. Astropaths described it as a thinning, like mist evaporating under a cold sun. Navigators crossing certain subsectors reported fewer psychic crosscurrents, fewer screaming echoes of mass emotion. The immaterium in those regions did not become safe. Nothing in the galaxy ever truly becomes safe, but it became muted. In the vast, tormented cosmos of Warhammer 40, emotion is fuel, rage feeds the blood god, despair nourishes the plague lord, ambition strengthens the architect of fate, excess empowers the prince of pleasure. For 10,000 years, humanity has burned with all of these in abundance. Billions praying in fear, billions dying in hatred, billions clinging to hope so desperately that even hope became a kind of agony. Then, in isolated pockets of space, that emotional furnace dimmed. The first demonic manifestation to fail occurred above the dead world of Surinth Prime. A minor warp fluctuation attempted to breach real space, something that would normally have birthed a localized incursion. Instead, the breach flickered and collapsed. There was no surge of terror to anchor it, no collective panic to widen the tear. The ritual energy that cultists might have provided simply did not exist. The planet was silent. Within the Imperium, this absence was not subtle. Where once there had been a steady hum of human anguish, there was now a void, a hole in the choir. And the warp does not ignore anomalies. Servants of Tees, each were the first to investigate. The changer of ways thrives on complexity, on schemes layered within schemes. Entire civilizations collapsing in orchestrated quiet without overt manipulation was intriguing. Demonic intelligences probed the region, searching for hidden rituals or suppressed devotion. They found none, no secret altars, no coded invocations, only abandoned infrastructure and perfectly ordered records. The conclusion was unsettling. Humanity had done this to itself. Elsewhere, the rage, fueled tides of corn diminished slightly along the edges of silent sectors. There were simply fewer wars to fight, fewer soldiers screaming defiance, fewer skulls taken in battle. Corn does not require worship, but he does require conflict. A world that chooses not to resist cannot provide it. Even the Garden of Decay tended by Nurgle felt the shift. Despair is fertile soil for the Plague Lord. Yet the gospel did not produce despair in the conventional sense. It produced acceptance, a calm relinquishment. Nurgle delights in clinging life rotting slowly, in suffering stretched across eternity. The gospel shortened suffering. It denied him duration, and in the shimmering excesses of Slaanesh, a curious starvation emerged. Excess requires sensation. Fear, ecstasy, indulgence, pain. The populations embracing extinction did so without spectacle. No grand orgies of destruction, no ecstatic suicides. Just quiet chemical cessation, no drama, no indulgence, no exquisite agony. For the first time since the birth of chaos, an idea had arisen that did not feed it. This realization did not go unnoticed by the greater powers of the warp. Meanwhile, in real space, the Imperium reacted with growing alarm. Reports from multiple sectors confirmed identical patterns. Stable worlds entering gradual demographic decline without rebellion or visible coercion. Administratum projections revealed an unsettling trend. Where the gospel took root, productivity initially remained stable, sometimes even improved. Crime rates dropped, civil unrest diminished, compliance with tithe requirements increased temporarily. It was as if populations, having accepted an endpoint, chose to conclude their duties responsibly. This disturbed the High Lords more than open revolt ever could. The Imperium knows how to crush rebellion. It understands how to purge heresy. It has procedures for demonic infestation and Xenos infiltration. But what is the protocol for citizens who obey every law, fulfill every obligation, and then calmly choose not to reproduce? The ecclesiarchy attempted to respond first. Sermons intensified across compliant sectors. Preachers declared the gospel a lie seeded by the ruinous powers. They invoked the eternal sacrifice of the Emperor of Mankind as proof that existence itself is sacred duty. They warned that suicide damns the soul, but the gospel had anticipated these arguments. It did not frame extinction as rebellion against the Emperor. It framed it as release from eternal exploitation. It asked, If the Emperor sacrifices endlessly to sustain humanity, is it not mercy to relieve him of the burden? If billions must die daily to power the Golden Throne, is it not kindness to reduce the demand? These questions spread through encrypted forums, through private devotional groups, through conversations between exhausted parents and overworked laborers. They were not shouted publicly, they were considered privately, and private doubts are harder to burn. Inquisitor Vale Torquemada of the Ordo Hereticus began compiling a comprehensive analysis of the phenomenon. Unlike many of her peers, she did not immediately assume chaos corruption. She examined warp readings before and after each Silent World event. The data was undeniable. Warp turbulence decreased measurably in affected regions. Astropathic strain lessened. Minor demonic manifestations declined. Her private notes contained a line she never intended to share. If this continues, entire sectors may become psychically inert. Psychic inertia in the Imperium is not inherently negative. Fewer warp storms mean safer travel. Reduced demonic activity means fewer catastrophic invasions. But the cost was population decline, not from war, not from plague, from choice. Torquemada faced a horrifying strategic paradox. The Imperium has authorized exterminatus countless times to deny resources to enemies. Entire planets have been bombed to prevent chaos footholds. If voluntary extinction achieves similar denial without collateral warp amplification, is it truly worse? She hated herself for even contemplating it. While the Imperium debated, the Tyranids approached a silent sector. A splinter of Hive Fleet Leviathan altered course toward a cluster of declining Agri worlds. Normally, such worlds would mount desperate defenses, broadcasting psychic terror across the warp. This time, resistance was minimal. Populations had already reduced drastically. Defensive forces fought, but not with the same manic fervor typical of doomed worlds. Many soldiers had accepted extinction long before the bio ships entered orbit. The Tyranids consumed the biomass regardless. They stripped oceans, devoured forests, absorbed what remained of human flesh, but their yield was lower than projections suggested. Livestock numbers had been intentionally reduced months earlier. Crops had been genetically modified to contain compounds that slowed Tyranid digestion efficiency. Ecosystems had been deliberately destabilized before abandonment. The gospel had evolved. It no longer merely advocated quiet death. It encouraged strategic denial. To starve the enemy, one must remove nourishment. The hive mind adapted as it always does. It recorded the inefficiencies. It adjusted feeding strategies. Yet even a superorganism must respond to input. A prey species intentionally reducing its biomass complicates optimization. The Tyranids are relentless, but they are also logical. A galaxy that gradually empties offers diminishing returns. Far from the conflict, ancient Necron dynasties observed the data with cold curiosity. The Silent King, ruler of a race that once chose biotransference to escape suffering, understood the impulse toward release. Humanity embracing extinction was not madness to the Necrons. It was familiar, yet there was a distinction. The Necrons sought immortality without pain. The Gospel sought non-existence without pain. Some Necron overlords allowed silent worlds to remain undisturbed, deeming them irrelevant. Others considered the long-term implications. An empire of the dead requires something to rule over. If organic life vanishes entirely, dominion becomes meaningless. Even tyrants require subjects. Thus, paradoxically, some Necrons began protecting certain human populations, not out of compassion, but out of self-interest. Within the Imperium, Space Marine chapters were dispatched to investigate. Among them were companies of ultramarines, operating under the broader strategic oversight of Robout Guilliman. Guilliman, resurrected into a galaxy far darker than the one he once knew, demanded direct reports. He reviewed the projections personally. Guilliman is a creature of logic as much as war. He understood statistics. He had once built Ultramar into a model of efficient governance. He saw, with painful clarity, the arithmetic underpinning the gospel. But he rejected its premise. Humanity's value to Guilliman was not solely numerical. It was aspirational. Even in decline, even in darkness, survival represented defiance. To choose extinction was to concede the galaxy to its worst elements without contest. Yet he also recognized a deeper danger. If the Imperium could not offer its citizens a believable path to improvement, even a distant one, the Gospel's logic would always return. Guilliman ordered reforms in select sectors, reduced tithe burdens, infrastructure stabilization, increased military protection. He did not publicly acknowledge the Gospel, but his actions revealed awareness. If despair fuels extinction, then alleviating despair might slow it. But the Imperium is vast. Reform travels slowly. Fatigue travels instantly. As silent worlds multiplied, the warp's response intensified. Demonic entities began attempting provocation rather than temptation. Instead of whispering promises of power, they orchestrated sudden horrors designed to trigger emotional spikes. Mass hallucinations, localized massacres, psychic assaults intended to reignite terror and rage. Chaos adapts. It does not require worship. It requires reaction, and even the calmest population can be provoked if sufficiently threatened. In one silent sector, a greater demon manifested above an already declining hive world, slaughtering thousands in a spectacle of carnage. The goal was not conquest. It was stimulation, to reignite the psychic signal, to remind humanity that suffering cannot be avoided. The result was unexpected. The population did not riot in terror. They did not rise in fury. Emergency services responded. Defensive forces engaged. Casualties mounted. But instead of panic, there was resignation. The event was recorded, processed, added to the ledger of inevitability. And then the decline continued. This unnerved the warp more than any exorcism. For 10,000 years, chaos had thrived on humanity's extremes. Now it faced a threat that offered neither devotion nor defiance, only withdrawal. Inquisitor Torquemada, reviewing the expanding data, realized the terrifying scale of what might unfold. If even 10% of the Imperium embraced the gospel fully, the psychic output of humanity would drop significantly. Warp travel might stabilize, demonic incursions could decrease, but the Imperium's manpower would collapse. Military capacity would shrink. Frontier worlds would fall not to rebellion, but to neglect. For 10,000 years, the Imperium of Man survived not because it was stable, but because it was absolute. Faith in the Emperor of Mankind was not optional. War was not questioned. Sacrifice was not debated. The structure endured because no alternative was permitted to exist long enough to compete. But the Gospel of Silent Extinction did not compete with bolters or banners. It did not promise rebellion. It did not preach chaos. It did not even reject the Emperor outright. It simply asked whether endless survival without victory was truly survival at all. And that question began to fracture faith from the inside. Across hive cities and agri-world settlements, conversations changed tone. Citizens still attended sermons. They still chanted litanies. They still paid tithes. Outwardly, nothing shifted. But privately, families began asking how many generations must be offered before the ledger balances. Workers calculated how many sons and daughters would be drafted before one lived to old age. Soldiers wondered whether defending a world destined for eventual annihilation was heroism or delay. The gospel spread not as an uprising, but as a conclusion reached independently by millions. The ecclesiarchy sensed it first in attendance patterns. Congregations remained full, yet something intangible was missing. The fervor had cooled. The shouted amens softened into murmurs. Confessors reported fewer frantic pleas for forgiveness and more quiet admissions of exhaustion. Exhaustion is dangerous in a regime built on zeal. Cardinal Veritas of Hydrafer declared the gospel the final temptation. He claimed it was a subtle scheme of T's inch, a manipulation designed to undermine humanity's will to fight. Public burnings resumed in several sectors. Datas, late suspected of containing gospel projections, were seized and destroyed. Entire archive wings were purged, but arithmetic does not burn easily. The projections reappeared elsewhere, recalculated by different hands. Suppressing them only validated their significance. Meanwhile, within the Adeptus Mechanicus, a separate and equally troubling analysis unfolded. The cult Mechanicus values efficiency above sentiment. Their mage, I began evaluating the resource expenditure required to maintain the Imperium's war machine. Plasma reactors fueled fleets that would be destroyed within decades. Forge Worlds produced titans only to see them reduced to molten slag in feudal campaigns. The Omnissiah teaches preservation of knowledge and machines, spirit, yet the Imperium consumed both at unsustainable rates. A senior Magos Dominus recorded a forbidden thesis. If the objective is long-term preservation of human, derived knowledge, then controlled reduction of population density may statistically increase survival probability of remaining data. It was not compassion, it was optimization. The gospel found unlikely allies among those who worshipped logic. As sectors quieted, something even more destabilizing occurred. Warp storms bordering silent regions weakened noticeably. Trade routes previously considered impassable reopened. Astropathic communication stabilized. Rogue trader captains reported smoother passages through nearby corridors. For the first time in centuries, certain systems experienced something resembling normalcy. No invasions. No demonic incursions. No apocalyptic sieges. Just absence. The implications were impossible to ignore. Humanity's psychic noise, its constant fear, rage, and desperation, had long churned the immaterium. If reducing that noise stabilized space itself, then the gospel was not merely philosophical. It was environmental. Inquisitor Vale Torquemada compiled updated data and presented it to a closed convocation of the Ordo Hereticus. She expected outrage. She received silence. The numbers were undeniable. In affected regions, a warp breach frequency down 18%. A minor demonic manifestations down 23%. Astropathic mortality down 12%. Navigational anomalies reduced measurably. But alongside those improvements, population decline averaging 31% per standard century. Astra Militarum recruitment reduced proportionally. Industrial output trending downward long term, it was a trade, less chaos, less humanity. Some inquisitors argued immediate extermination of all gospel, infected worlds not to save them, but to prevent the ideology from spreading. Others, more radical, proposed weaponization, designate doomed frontier planets as silent zones, allow them to depopulate voluntarily, creating psychic buffers against the warp. The debate nearly devolved into violence, because at its core, the gospel forced the Imperium to confront an unbearable truth. Its survival strategy fed its enemies. Every act of fear strengthened chaos. Every desperate battle empowered orcs. Every mass death signaled tyrannids. Every psychic scream rippled across the warp. The Imperium's strength was also its beacon. As this realization spread among higher command, responses grew more extreme. Propaganda intensified across compliant sectors. The litany of defiant existence was introduced. A counter, doctrine proclaiming that every human birth is an act of war against oblivion. New holidays celebrated reproductive duty. Tithe incentives were offered for larger families. Penal colonies were restructured into forced population growth initiatives. Yet coercion breeds resentment, and resentment often leads back to the gospel's central promise, peace through cessation. Amid these tensions, the Adeptus Astartes took more direct action. Several chapters were tasked with rooting out ideological contamination. Entire populations were subjected to psychological screening. suspected gospel sympathizers were detained. One captain of the Ultramarines, reviewing the records of a silent, adjacent world, voiced a question that would never appear in official transcripts: if their silence reduces demonic incursion. Are we punishing stability? His chaplain responded immediately with scripture affirming the sanctity of eternal struggle. Yet the question lingered. Even among genetically enhanced super soldiers, doubt is not impossible. Far beyond imperial borders, the tyrannid hive mind adjusted feeding patterns. The reduction of biomass in certain regions triggered strategic recalculations. Hive fleet splinters diverted toward denser prey concentrations. The result was a subtle redistribution of devastation. Worlds far from silent sectors suffered intensified assault. Ironically, the gospel may have indirectly saved some systems by making others more appealing targets. This introduced another ethical fracture. If selective extinction protects neighboring worlds by making them less attractive to invaders, is it not a sacrifice of fewer to preserve more? The Imperium has always embraced such calculus on battlefields, in orbital bombardments, in sanctioned exterminatus. But those were imposed decisions. The gospel made them voluntary. Voluntary sacrifice unsettled authority more than enforced sacrifice ever had. Meanwhile, within the warp, agitation grew. Demons cannot comprehend non-existence as strategy. They are manifestations of emotion and excess. A species deliberately withdrawing from emotional extremes is an existential insult to them. Greater demons began attempting a new tactic: inspiration of fanatic opposition. If the gospel promoted quiet, chaos would promote noise. Entire cults were incited not toward subtle corruption, but toward spectacular atrocity. Massacres broadcast across psychic channels to reignite fear in silent regions. In one sector, a chaos war, and led by a champion of Abaddon, the despoiler targeted a declining world specifically because of its calm. They expected minimal resistance and maximum terror. They found resistance but not terror. The defending forces fought efficiently, without fanaticism, without hatred. Civilians did not riot. They did not panic. They evacuated methodically. Casualties were recorded without hysteria. Even as cities burned, the emotional surge chaos sought failed to ignite fully. The warband withdrew, frustrated. They had destroyed infrastructure, but not achieved the psychic crescendo they desired. For chaos, apathy is poison. Back in his archive chamber, Malvernese Hale observed these developments with growing unease. He had believed the gospel might simply end suffering quietly. He had not foreseen galactic ramifications, warp stabilization, tyrannid redistribution, inquisitorial schisms. Astarte's doubt, the gospel was no longer a hypothesis. It was reshaping the strategic landscape of the galaxy. And with every silent world, a new question emerged, one even Hale had not calculated initially. If enough of the Imperium embraces extinction, and the warp grows calmer as a result, could chaos itself weaken permanently? The possibility was staggering. The chaos gods are vast beyond comprehension. They are sustained by all sentient life, not just humanity. Yet humanity is among the largest psychic contributors in the galaxy. A measurable reduction in emotional output would not destroy chaos, but it might diminish its intensity. A galaxy less turbulent, a warp less violent, a slower spiral into damnation, at the cost of trillions of lives never lived. The fracture in faith widened. Among the faithful, a new anxiety surfaced. What if the Emperor's eternal struggle was not meant to preserve humanity indefinitely, but to buy time? And if so, for what? If no golden age awaits, if no great crusade will be reborn, then what is the end goal? The gospel offered an answer. There is no end goal, there is only delay, and delay is suffering extended. As silent sectors expanded, an unforeseen phenomenon occurred. Astropaths reported difficulty detecting emotional signatures from depopulated systems. It was not merely reduced, It was absent. The warp over those regions felt hollow, and in the hollowness something stirred. Not chaos, not tyrannid, not Necron, but the absence itself began to exert influence. Ships passing through deep silent zones described an uncanny sensation, like drifting through a tomb without walls. No whispers, no currents, just stillness. For navigators accustomed to the Immaterium's constant turbulence, it was deeply unsettling.